Hi and welcome to day 4 of the UN Theme Week. I'm Freya and the project coordinator for day 4, which focuses on SDG 7, clean and affordable energy, and SDG 11, sustainable cities. I'm really excited to be introducing this event on energy transitions. We'll be hearing from 5 panelists about energy resources globally, offshore wind, solar energy in Bergen, transitioning from coal in Eastern Europe, and energy transitions in South Africa. After these presentations, we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we'll move into a Q&A session where you can ask the panelists all your questions about their themes and presentations. So during their presentations, please feel free to write your questions in the Q&A box in the chat below. So thank you very much for joining, and I'll now hand over to Kristin for the first presentation.
Thank you. Try to share my screen here to have a presentation. Hello, my name is Kristin Guldbrandsen Frøysa, and I'm Energy Director at University of Bergen, and I have the pleasure to start this session, and I will just give a very brief introduction to the topic of energy resources in a global perspective. If we look at energy consumption by sector, we see that thermal is has the highest volume with 51%. This is a bit old figures, but the overall picture is still the same. Transport 32% and power 17%. And as you can see from this figure, it's not very much renewable in there. Power is the best, while transport has the lowest share of renewable. If we look at the energy share, renewable share of the total energy, final energy consumption, you see that fossil fuels has almost 80%. This is a bit newer figures. Modern renewables accounts for just 11%, and that's very low. And it might seem very kind of scaring and impossible to replace all this fossil fuel with modern renewable. But it is important to mention and have in mind that the transition from fossil fuel to renewable is also a transition towards a more energy efficient use, because renewables are much more efficient than fossil fuels. You lose much less energy when you use modern renewables than when you use fossil fuels. And I think that should be help us to see this as a doable thing. It is possible to do the transition. It's hard work, but we are not to replace all the fossil fuel energy. So that is the good news. Having a closer look at electricity, we see that 27.3% of the electricity by end of 2019 were renewable. And as you see, it's hydropower is dominating. Then you have wind power, solar, and bio and geothermal and other sources as well. But where the growth is to come is in wind power and solar. So I will give a very brief talk about that now. It is the wind resources. This is the map of the wind resources. And as you can see, and as you know, as living here along the North Sea, it's very windy. So Northern Europe has very good wind resources, both onshore and offshore. There is also good resources along east and west coast of North America, South Africa, South Australia, and some other places as well. But Northern Europe is blessed with a lot of good wind resources. When it comes to solar PV, it's not that favorable in our latitudes. And as you can see on the map, they haven't bothered to include latitudes higher than 60 degrees. And of course, the best solar resources are on lower latitudes. But solar PV is also it's better with solar PV in our region than you may think about, because solar panels in our region are cool and they are more efficient when it's cold. And also they are, here in Bergen at least, cleaned very often by the rain. So they are more efficient than what you could expect. But of course, the best region is in Southern Europe and other more sunny regions. But solar PV is going to be one of the dominating energy resources when we talk about renewable energy. And as you can see on this slide, we have a lot of growth. It's growing very, very fast. And if you look at forecasts from, for instance, 2005, they have not at all foreseen this enormous growth in solar PV. And it's also coming in various regions: China, United States, Japan, Germany, India. So this is a very, very important source, and it's growing very, very fast. When it comes to wind power, it's also growing. And as you can see, it's growing fast as well. And we're talking about installed capacity. So the wind turbines at various sites will have a different, various annual production due to the wind resources. And in general, offshore wind is better than onshore wind. But as you see, this is also an energy source that is growing very, very fast. A quick look at offshore wind. And as you can see, that has been growing as well, and it's growing fast. But that is basically European and Asian for the time being. North America is coming, but for the time being, it's Europe and Asia. In order to have a very quick look at the energy system, I looked at the energy system at the UK, the energy sources for the power production on Monday in UK, and I will compare it with the energy production in Norway. And as you can see, there are many sources in the energy mix in the UK. It's varying through the day, and as you can see, solar is important during the day. You have, of course, gas. You have nuclear as a baseload, biomass and waste as a baseload as well. And you have offshore and onshore wind. So this is really a mix when it comes to UK, various sources. You have also a very tiny share of hard coal parts of that day. Looking at Norway, it's a completely different picture as you might expect. It's basically hydropower, and then there are also a significant amount of onshore wind that day. But that's a completely different system, as you see. We don't have time to go into details here, but the main and take-home message here is that the prices of renewable is falling sharply. It's getting much cheaper, and that is the main reason why, for instance, why solar PV has become so widespread, is that the prices has decreased so much over the last 10 years. So renewable energy is now often cheaper than fossil fuels. And I think that is, of course, very important in order to deploy much more renewable energy in the years to come. So my last slide is also to give some kind of hope for people looking for jobs, because the renewable business is giving a lot of jobs. And as you can see, it's divided both on solar, bioenergy, hydropower, wind, and geothermal. So there are a lot of jobs coming there through this energy transition. So that was my very brief introduction. I look forward to the rest of this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin, for your presentation. We'll now move on to Astrid, who will be talking about offshore wind.
Thank you. I am a PhD candidate at the Geophysical Institute and the Bergen Offshore Wind Center. And there I work with the offshore wind and how to simulate the offshore wind field and its impact on the response of wind turbines. But today I will give you an introduction to offshore wind and offshore wind turbines in general. So we can't really talk about offshore wind without mentioning onshore. So the slide or the graph you see here, we see the increase in capacity of onshore wind turbines from 2010 to 2019. And as you also saw in Kristin's slide, it has been increasing quite rapidly. We see that offshore wind is really a tiny bit in comparison to onshore, but the share of offshore is increasing. So in 2019, it was between 5 and 10%, I think. So it's really becoming more and more important. And this figure here shows the capacity and where it is placed. And we can see that the European Union is really the major player in offshore wind today. And other countries are coming, but they haven't come far yet. So as I showed you in the previous picture, offshore wind is not really big as of today. So it provides less than 1% of the global power production, but the potential is huge. So we expect that the theoretical potential is 18 times the world demand of electricity today. So most analysts expect that offshore wind will become more important in the future. And this figure here shows the prognosis from the IEA. So it's just a prognosis, but it's what most analysts expect the evolution to go in this direction. So we see the capacities of offshore wind in 2040, and we see that the European Union will stay the most important player, but China and the United States and other countries will also come. And as Kristin showed you, the European Union is really a major player because it has such good wind conditions. And within Europe, we have mostly Germany and United Kingdom that produces offshore wind energy today, and they will also resume the biggest players in the future, but other countries will also play a bigger role. So why should we place the wind turbines offshore? The biggest reason is that the wind potential is better. And by this, we mean that the wind is more stable, but more importantly, that the wind speeds are higher, so we can produce more electricity. There are also larger areas available. Of course, you have conflicts with, for instance, fishermen, but compared to onshore, there are huge areas available. It's also easier to get acceptance in the public, as you don't take areas of the nature that people used to walk in, or it's close to their house and it's noisy. So if we place them offshore, it's out of people's view. There's also been a problem with the transportation of large wind turbine blades. So, and this transportation is much easier offshore, where you can transport the blades by boats instead of roads. So why don't we place all the wind turbines offshore? Well, it's been costly in the past. So offshore wind has required subsidies in order to be built, but we see today that there are some parks being built without subsidies, so the costs are really coming down. There are also other issues, for instance, with accessibility. It's more difficult to install wind turbines offshore, as the conditions are harsher and you cannot go out in a storm and install a wind turbine. This is also a problem for maintenance. And imagine if you have an important part broken, you cannot produce electricity for a long while, and then you lose money. Of course, the wind turbines will also have higher loads offshore. As the winds are higher, there are waves and currents, corrosion, etc. So it's all more complex. And then I didn't really, or you could really place the environmental impact on both places, as there are pros and cons for placing them offshore versus onshore. Onshore, you need to build a lot of roads. This takes views, of course, but also animal habitats. But offshore, you have an impact on sea life. So this impact can be, for instance, the noise from installing the wind turbine. But you may also have a positive impact, as the fishermen won't go and fish in the areas of the wind turbine. So this will be a safe haven where you will have more fish. And then I want to show you some trends that we see in the industry. So we see that wind turbines are getting larger and larger. And by this, the energy produced, or the capacity per turbine, is getting larger and larger. So in 2019, we had a 12 megawatt wind turbine installed with a wingspan of 220 meters. And there's a 15 megawatt wind turbine already released or launched, and in the future we expect even bigger. So it's hard to get the relation to how large this is. So here in this wind turbine that we expect to come in the future, I've placed 5 times the town hall of Bergen. So you can have you can imagine how large these structures really are. Here you can see a picture of the world's largest wind park. So the parks are also getting larger. It contains already 174 turbines, and it's getting bigger. This park here is rather small, but it's the first floating wind park. So these wind turbines are not standing on the bottom, but rather they're floating. And we haven't seen many of these yet, as they are more costly than the bottom fixed. And this is also a reason why we see that the European Union, or the north of Europe, is doing good in terms of wind turbines, as the bottom fixed are cheaper and we have quite shallow seas in the north of Europe. So the foundation depends on the water depth, as I just mentioned. So onshore, we just have the tower. In shallow waters, we just have a longer tower that is attached to the bottom. While in deep waters, we have different foundations, and here many solutions exist. So as I mentioned, floating wind turbines are more expensive, but they can be placed in deeper water, and therefore they have a greater potential worldwide. And for the floaters, a lot of solutions exist. There is not really a winner concept yet, and this is also one of the reasons why it's more expensive, as we haven't really seen the economy of scale yet. So here you can see lots of different floaters, and we can see that most of them are semi-subs, so they are partly submerged into the ocean. So I think that was all from me, and I'm looking forward to try to answer your questions later.
Thank you, Astrid, for your presentation. That was really interesting. Now we're going to move on to Tor, who's going to be talking about solar energy in Bergen.
Thank you for the invitation. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, but we can also see the slides that are coming up next.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well. Okay. Now I'm in presentation mode. Okay. Thank you for your invitation. Interesting subject. I will try to give a perspective from a commercial real estate developer and owner. And my name is Tor Instenes, representing GC Reber Eiendom, who's a real estate company, and Marine Holmen Research Park. We do extended cooperation with University of Bergen on several areas. Could you just give me a thumbs up that the sound is good? Okay. So this picture here shows one of our buildings, solar panels in Bergen, as Kristin said, nice and clean by the rain, and these have been operational for I think 5 years now. I'll come a little bit back to that. Okay, who are we? We operate around 250,000 square meter commercial real estate, and we build 8 to 10,000 square meters a year is our goal. We are building the last 2 years. We've been building a hotel and a commercial real estate building in cross-laminated timber, as you see on the picture to the right there.
Tor, sorry to interrupt you. I think you're not quite in full screen mode.
I'm not in full screen mode. Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Let me see. I'm sharing the. I'll try to stop share and start it again. Sorry for that. Does this look better or is the same?
Yes, that's great.
Okay, thank you. So we are both building and operating buildings, and latest building to the right there. So we are a developer that try to learn from operating buildings and to bring that knowledge back to the to new buildings. We are also in the commercial area. We have to take to what do our customers need, what do they think is important, and we also have to think how what will the owners think and what will the banks think, and we have to think in the present mode and also think ahead in the whole lifetime of the building. And this is an important perspective because we have to build sustainable in many ways. We have to build something that we think is future-proof. So, and to help us, we have, as many companies, carved out goals, which sustainability goals we want to help to the world to target to get. But also we work with a system called BREEAM. This is a British system which gives a building, both commercial real estate building, private homes, a stamp of approval. So you get different levels. So we have in our strategy the excellent, which is 4 out of 5 on a scale, and we need to qualify on different areas. So energy, which we're going to talk about today, is 1. Health and well-being. Try to get something new into a building. The materials used, like we said, we build a massive wood, not concrete, not steel, and how the building pollutes in both the materials used, but also in its lifetime. Can you transport yourself to the building with bus or train, or do you have to take a car and so forth? So it's a whole system, and it gives you points, and it's externally external improvement. So you can't just do green what's it called? You just talk it up. It has to be solid stuff. So this is important for us. And why solar energy? Well, we think it's an important part of our energy mix. Obviously, it's not the only one, but it's important part. And we want to also learn from trying new things, innovation, trying something new in a building is part of our strategy. So we have put this on several buildings. The picture here is from our building that was finished now 3 months ago. So you see we have the solar panels on the roof. But in the future, we'll probably put it on several other places. We also see that the price will go down. So even if we invest in it and it's a little costly, it will get cheaper in the time. And we have so far put it on the roofs, but in future probably on the facade as well. This is on a building we built 5 years ago. It's situated in Marineholmen, which some of you may know this area. So here we have a solar energy mix of solar on the roof. We have central heating water. We have seawater that cools. Sorry for not translating this, but we have seawater coming from bottom of the fjord that cools the building. And we try to make an efficient use of several energy sources. And also it's important how we design the buildings. So this building at Marineholmen, which is situated very close to the meteorological station in Bergen, we have made this data from how much energy the panels create accessible for outside use. So then you can compare the meteorological data and how much energy is produced, and maybe learn something more. So as you see, good data on both the present day, month, and so forth of the lifespan of this installment. So in production for almost 5 years, yeah, we experience very little maintenance, so that's positive. About 80,000 kilowatt hours a year, 20% of the building electricity needs. And we have had little problems so far with maintenance on them or damage. It's a variation throughout the month, as you see. This is in 1 month. This is August 2021. And this is, of course, from which kind of weather it is in Bergen. Not all days are sunny, as you know. So here there is a lot of data to be analyzed to see how they work and how efficient they are. So this is something missing from this one. Oh, here it is. Yes. So production depends annually on the solar, how the sun is towards the building, and we have closeness to how we simulated how much energy it was going to produce and how much it actually produced. So this was good for us. And this is how much sun there is. There is difference also in the different years, of course, how much sun will be. So pretty close to what we, sorry, this is Norwegian, from the simulation to what we actually got. So this is also down to the different panels, how it's placed. It's something that we used a lot of time on when designing the building. So, and this on the last building, we see also that the price per unit decreased. So this is what we expected, from 19,000 to 13,000, and it will decrease even more. In the last building, we also tried something new, and As you know, Norway has a big market share of electrical cars. They have a lifetime use as a car, but after it's not efficient to use it as a car, the battery has a longer lifetime. So, and we see that the prices on electricity also varies in Norway. This is, of course, to make incentive to use electricity when other at the time of the day when it's cheaper, so to flatten out the curve, so to say. But we can use that, the price variation. Here is also, it is important to lower the maximum effect that we take out in the use of a building. So then we do something we call peak shaving. So we use the batteries, the car batteries, to store energy when we use little energy in the building, and we use that to shave off the peak, so to say. So we use in a constant less energy, and then we save money. So, and in winter we can do peak shaving in this way, and in summer we can we charge it from the normal electricity, but in the spring and fall we can charge it with the solar panels. So we can use it in different types. So this is how it's installed. We do it now with 10 batteries from 10 old Nissel leaves. So yes, this is my presentation. Energy, very important for us to have the right energy mix, and it's very also important for us to have sort of a story to the building, and that is future-proof, that it's sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Tor, for your presentation. We'll now move on to Vadim, who will be talking about the phase out of coal in Eastern Europe.
Let me just connect. Okay, do you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, and sort of the full slide. Okay, so hello and thank you for having me on this panel. I am a postdoc at the Center for Climate and Energy Transformation, studying energy transition. And today I'm going to be talking about coal phase out in Europe, particularly in the electricity sector, because this is my main research area. And of course, coal is most critical for phase out for emission reduction, because this is the most carbon intensive fuel. And this is a history of coal in global electricity generation and its desired future. Desired future in the sense if we want to stay within 1.5 degree of global warming. And you see that according to some average 1.5 degree compatible scenario, coal use and electricity should be cut almost by 4 by the year 2030. And honestly, global trends, current global trends, even with COVID taken into account, are not in line with this. But now let's look at Europe, and let's look particularly at the European Union. And in this presentation, I'm including the UK in data for the European Union, because I'm dealing mostly with historical data. So if you look at coal, sort of the brown line, you see that contrary to the global trend, East has already been declining, especially in the last 10-15 years. And now it is more than twice as low as the historical peak. But is this consistent with the EU climate targets? The EU doesn't have specific targets for coal use, but it has this recent target of 55% emission reduction by 2030 compared to 1990. And according to some estimate, this translates to approximately this point, something like 55 terawatt hours per year. And when you look at this historical decline trend, this doesn't look particularly impossible. So you may extrapolate it in different way, but it doesn't strike you as something impossible. But actually, to judge its feasibility, we have to look at individual countries, because it is countries that define coal phase-out pledges. And one platform for countries to make some pledges is so-called Powering Past Coal Alliance, created in 2017, and its member commit to phase out unabated coal generation and not to build any new coal plants without operational carbon capture and storage. And there are 17 new members plus the UK who are members of this alliance, and many of them, though not all, have specific time for coal phase out. And this is how the International Energy Agency summarizes these pledges. Most EU countries are planning to close all coal power plants by 2030, except Poland, the Czech Republic, Germany, and a few others. So basically, this looks nice. Almost everybody is going to close their coal by 2030, except for a handful of outliers. But if we look at these countries more specifically, we will see that these three countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Germany, account for 69% of all coal-fired generation in the EU. And a few others are mainly Bulgaria and Romania, which account for another 6%. So basically, everybody is going to close down their coal by 2030, except for the countries which burn 75% of coal in the European Union. So what's so special about these countries, and why are they so slow in phasing out their coal? First, these are countries, EU members ranked by their coal-fired generation. So Germany is the biggest, followed by Poland, and so on. And we can see that almost all of these countries are on this list of biggest coal users. And only Germany has a specific official phase-out date. You may have heard about their program, either 2035 or 38, depending on some intermediate review, and allocating something like 40 billion euros to support coal-producing regions. Then other countries, these 5 countries from the previous slide are marked in blue. They don't have specific phase-out dates. I will explain about these question marks later in my presentation. But what's so special about these countries and what makes them different from, say, Netherlands and Italy? So this next table shows the biggest coal producers in the EU, countries with significant coal mining, also ranked from top to bottom. And here you will see that sort of all these 5 countries are the 5 biggest coal producers in the EU, which means that they have domestic coal production, coal mining sector. And coal mining is usually politically sensitive, with coal miners having traditions of historical traditions of protest and collective actions. And very often the whole regions or communities depend on coal mining for their wealth and identity. So therefore, coal mining phase out, in a sense, is a more difficult task than simply phasing out coal for electricity. And it is coal mining that is often a constraint for phasing out coal from electricity. And now we will look at some specific national examples, basically these 4 countries except for Germany. So this is a very recent Poland's plan, officially adopted just a month ago in February. And this is coal and electricity. And one thing we immediately see that now they produce something like 75% of the electricity from coal. Then there are 2 trajectories of phase out, depending on European carbon emission prices. And but even the lowest trajectory puts us at 37% of generation of coal in generation in 2030. And if we do some math, this translates into 75 terawatt hours, which is more than the European 55 I was talking about a bit earlier. And then coal still stays in 2040 and will still be running for a few years after that. So there are no specific phase-out date for coal and electricity. There is something like coal mining, end of coal mining date, which according to a recent agreement between the government, the biggest mining company, and the unions is 2049. And first, it is just a very long period. And second, there is another problem which looks, this timeline looks like a fantasy. Why? Because Polish coal mining is already losing money. So even before Corona in 2019, this mining company lost almost $100 billion. So it's going to be kept afloat for another 30 years, and somebody is going to pay for this. Either this is going to be state aid or some EU funds. And for example, there is a recently created Just Transition Fund, a part of the European Green New Deal, which in principle is supposed to handle exactly this kind of situation, where some groups or communities are affected by necessary transition, they can be supported. But with this timeline, this doesn't look like a plan of some phase out. This looks more like a plan for just keeping the unprofitable industry afloat. So it is not very likely that this plan will get some financial support. So probably Poland will have to come up with something more realistic. And another piece of recent news from Poland. The main utility of Poland recently, generating company, recently announced its desire to become fully renewable by 2050 and 50% renewable by 2030. And this got some praise from some sources. But again, there is some important qualification. This whole plan depends on some state entity taking over its coal mining assets, something like shown in this figure, this huge open pit mine. And it is likely that there are not many entities willing to take over these assets. So effectively, this is just a hot potato game. So please somebody take this, and whoever ends up holding it in their hands loses. So this is the state of coal phase out in Poland. Then there is a recent plan of Romania, according to which the country intends to cut its installed coal capacity by half by 2030. But this still will be a sizable coal power fleet. And the average age of plants will be something like 44 years, which is pretty old, and they will still be going to run for some time. This is going to be substituted mostly by gas, which is not good because this locks the system into another fossil fuel. But the good news is that plans for a big coal-fired plant have been cancelled. So probably German Datteln 4, launched in 2020, would be the last big coal power plant ever launched in the European Union. Then the Czech Republic, they had a coal commission similar to one in Germany. The commission recommended phase-out date 2038, but Social Democrats in the government insist on 2033. The question is being debated, but the final date will be most likely within this range. And Bulgaria doesn't have a clear phase-out date or plan. According to some plans, they still going to have 30% of electricity from coal in 2030. And in August 2020, the Minister of Energy told that they're going to keep coal-fired generation until 2050 due to energy security reasons, basically as domestic, easily acceptable fuel, easily available fuel. So this is the experience of the EU and particularly its eastern members in coal phase-out. And although most of the regions of the world are not there yet, there are, for example, these Asian giants who are still expanding their coal generation, and there are massive exporters who are not losing money, like Australia, Indonesia, or Russia. And there are countries, for example, like South Africa, which produces 90% of electricity from coal. And I would be interested to hear from the next speaker what are their plans about this. But still, this shows a possible future of other coal-producing countries, regions. So why this experience is interesting beyond the European Union. Thank you for your attention, and let's discuss it further.
Thank you, Vadim, for your presentation. So now we'll move on to Tor, who's going to be talking about energy transitions in South Africa.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I'm starting screen sharing, and then it was not there. It was there when we tested, and now it's not there. I have to start my presentation. There it is. I will to share screen once more. Yes, now it's there. I was working on in an international group studying energy transition in 4 important countries, China, India, Brazil, South Africa. And this project ended for 5 years, sorry, 5 years ago, so I'm not fully updated. I try to update some facts, but as you probably know, the sustainable energy area isn't a topic where things are happening very, very fast, and political conditions in South Africa are quite shaky. So it's just a general outline, and we are not really sure what is going to happen. That is my last slide about what are the probable roads the development can take. South Africa has many forms of energy. It is mainly a coal-fired country. 84% coal is rather a high percentage, and they have very good conditions for solar PV, and they have actually a lot of uranium in the ground, so they have nuclear power plant, the only one in Africa, and they have both old and new wind farms. So the first general aspect here is quite some positive things and quite some negative things from our perspective. They had very good infrastructure, a very successful electrical system, started early around 1900. They have huge natural energy resources of many kinds, not so much hydroelectric power, but other forms. They had, after apartheid and when democracy came, they had a huge and partly successful Energy for All campaign. And they have a lot of human resources, workforce. That is a positive way of saying that there is a lot of unemployment. And the payments are rather low, but from an investment perspective, that is of course more promising. The negative side, it's as I mentioned, they are very high in the dependence on coal energy in their system, and they had from 2008, and actually more and more dramatic through the years, they had an energy supply crisis. They can't produce enough electricity, and they can't get the electricity out in a reliable way. And there is, of course, wind and solar power, but very slow uptake compared to other countries and compared to what we thought was possible when we arrived there. So the question is, why is South Africa not changing fast into a country of sustainable energy as a main energy source? And there is a small, this is the highest chimney in Africa, and it is also the world's most extreme point, single point, where outlet of CO2. So, and this is kind of example. Why are they doing this? This is a production plant where they use coal to produce petrol for cars. It's very expensive, it's very polluting, and it is a technology from World War II, Germany, Hitler. And it was a technology that seemed to be sensible in South Africa during apartheid, because there was a UN initiative boycott of South Africa to try to get rid of apartheid. And then they didn't have a reliable import of oil, so they started this coal to petrol technology. And why are they doing this now? After many years of democracy, no apartheid, no boycott anymore, it is still extremely polluting, it's still an expensive process. So you need to be a political scientist to understand this. This is, of course, this is a main line of my explanation of the problems in South Africa. It is about politics, it's about trade unions, it's about corporate power, it is about institutional slowness, it's about path dependence and lock-ins that are supported by political factors. Yeah, we can keep that one. I think the main problems are political, and a lot of people, they are talking about the MEC, that is the mineral electricity complex, that is the mining companies, the coal mines, and the energy companies, and the other mining industry using energy. So it's the they actually have an organization for intense energy using companies, and they are heavily into mining. And this mineral electricity complex was very important for South African economy. Cheap labor, cheap energy. That was the main selling point from a global capitalistic perspective during the apartheid. And this is linked still to the government. They are the strong cooperating partners. And there are also smaller mechanisms makes this development away from coal and into other energy sources difficult. Like old times in Norway, important part of municipal income to the regional and local level, it was linked to a price premium on electricity. That is 30–40% of many South African regional authorities' budget, so they rely on selling electricity. And then we have the state monopoly of electricity wholesale, and that state monopoly is the coal producing organization. So the coal producing state monopoly, they sell energy to municipalities that sell to ordinary households. So if an ordinary household are starting to use solar panels, they actually become a kind of tax evaders, and of course it's nice to do. It's a nice development, and a lot of people are doing it, but the municipality, they have serious problems with this shift. Same thing happened to a big program in Cape Town. They decided to have solar water heaters on the roof of ordinary buildings. All new buildings, all new homes should have a solar water heater. Quite a brilliant idea, but to implement it was not successful at all. And it's difficult mechanisms behind here, but the very, very simple fact is that it's very difficult to implement something that you will lose money, lose income when you implement it from local authorities. And of course, both wind power is medium scale, solar power is small scale. So instead of having like 10 to 20 huge coal-fired power production plants, you will have in the future like hundreds of thousands or millions of small producers. Think about when we went from 10 large mainframe computers in Norway to 10 million small computers and smartphones. So that is quite a workload for the regulation authorities, and they have their education, their way of thinking, their organization, their institutional power is linked to this old centralized system. And when we interviewed the top executives there, they said quite frankly that we think solar power panels on houses are ugly, and we don't know how we can handle millions of them in the future. That was, of course, 6 years ago. We had this interview. They wouldn't put it that way now, but it explained why the uptake is slow. And also, the companies delivering solar panels, and even more the companies that delivers wind power to South Africa, they are foreign, they are white. So this is rich white people from Europe. This is not hundreds of trade union members of the relative poor black communities that are getting work, like in the coal mines. So it has a kind of not the right good flavor seen from centralized political system. So they invested, got help from the World Bank to build the second largest coal-fired plant that went into power production as late as 2015. Of course, there are wind and solar power and very successful small projects, and actually one project to try to help when the crisis was at its most dramatic. They had several rounds of buying power from private companies produced with wind and with a feed-in tariff and based on an auction principle. And this is very, very successful. You can find articles about how successful this was. But of course, you have to have a system that allows this and buys the power and takes the power into the state monopoly grid. So this was done 4 times, and when everyone was waiting for the 6th round and the rounds to be bigger and bigger, the whole project was stopped, and there was quite complicated and very difficult political processes that ended up with a decision to have nuclear as the main solution for the energy crisis. There are, of course, solar panels on some private housing, but the most of the growth are like in Bergen, actually. Most of the growth in solar power is on rooftop belong to companies like shops, banks, service industries. So there is a market, and of course the high prices of energy and the unreliability of energy in South Africa, it's an additional motivation for actually buying into both wind power and solar power from both private homes and companies. When we landed in Cape Town the first time to start our project, the day after, everything went dark. They call it load shedding. Parts of the town are turned off for 2 to 4 hours and then turned back on again to try to get the electricity system to survive. They have to ration out electricity in this way. So, and still there are load shedding and quite a huge amount of practical problems. In addition to load shedding, they actually have emergency power plants that runs on diesel. That is very, very expensive and a lot of pollution. This is, of course, a big political problem, and the government, they decided to go to war against this energy crisis problem. So they established what they call the war room in 2014 to take direct action, but it was not very successful. They did something. They got into an alliance with this program for introducing more wind power into the grid system, but then it stopped. Latest news, I really don't know what is happening, but both in 2019 and 2020, the government decided to use nuclear power as the main solution for the energy crisis in South Africa. But as we all know, nuclear power is taking a very long time to build, and it's very expensive. It's an expensive and slow solution if we will call it a solution. But even now in 2021, there is a plan for doing this, but it's not linked to finance, it's not linked to a site, it's not linked to a company, it's just a governmental plan, more or less in the air. And my personal opinion is that it will not happen. So last slide, crisis still. Which of course the crisis is also a huge economic crisis for Eskom, the state monopoly. And they are getting more and more money, but how much money can they get? How much can they, how can they do this? So we can see 3 possible scenarios. One is that the coal-based and helped with a little nuclear power. Nuclear power now is around 5%, down to 3.6% actually now because of some technical problems, but they will try to use nuclear to help the coal system, and we will get still 70–80% coal-based energy system in South Africa. I don't believe it is economically or politically possible to implement that. Then we have from the economist Schumpeter, the theory of creative destruction. It looks a bit like creative destruction in South Africa. The grid is not working well. There are reliability problems. We have the load shedding system. We have emergency power. We have steep rising prices. So more and more we see private enterprise fixing their own energy, buying their own wind power, buying their own PV system, try to sell to other companies, try to sell to homes. It is not legal, but they do it anyway. So there are growing kind of new solutions from bottom from the bottom, but not in a tidy way and very slowly. And maybe it will be a serious crisis when the coal-fired power plants will just go out of business, lack of maintenance, just being there like an old coal-fired ship in the 1930s. They just went out of business. So it might be a scenario of creative destruction. Or we can hope for a sustainable, decentralized structure, a plan that use the natural resources of South Africa to build cheap wind power and cheap solar power and a more decentralized grid system. And that can actually be done both politically and with the natural resources they have. But there are no political constellations now that are pointing in that direction. The new government now is much better than the old one, but the new prime minister is actually linked very heavily into the fossil fuel solution. His personal money, he has a lot of them, made from gas production and use of gas. So I'm not an optimist in the sense that the political institutional path dependence problems looks like to be very, very serious for South Africa, but they have natural resources, they have the manpower, and now it also seems like a good economic solution to go the sustainable energy way. But we can hope, but it's probably going to be worse before it gets better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tor, for your presentation. Okay, so now I think we'll take a very short break and then we'll move on to the Q&A session. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A box down below and then we'll get them answered in the next session. So we'll take a couple of minutes now just as a short break. So I think we can restart and go back into the Q&A session. So perhaps if all the panelists can turn on their camera, and then we can ask some questions. But before we get into the question session, we also wanted to add that we will have a competition at the end of this event. So there'll be some Fedora vouchers to win. So please stay tuned into that, and we'll give you instructions at the end. But now onto the questions. So I have a question here for Kristin. So you outlined in your presentation that resources for energy vary across the globe, and people are wondering whether this makes international policy and implementing this policy quite difficult, considering there's such variation.
Yes, it makes it difficult in some ways, because you need to utilize the resources in different ways in different countries. But of course, you can also utilize the technology development, for instance, done in Europe in other countries. So yeah, it may make it difficult, and also, but there is also opportunities, because if you link energy production, for instance, in Norway with continental Europe, you will have a kind of more even production. So you can utilize hydropower to take some of the peaks in Europe, and also import wind energy from Europe into Norway, and use our hydropower magazines to store that additional capacity.
And that links in with another one of our questions here, which is asking about if any of the panels see tidal energy as an important source for the future. And of course, it's expensive to build, but how reliable is it? Yep, Vadim.
Okay, so may I try to answer this? So unfortunately, in the current world, I don't see much prospects for tidal energy, and it's not because it is inherently bad. This is mainly because the logic of technology life cycle. Because technology first emerges in a niche, and then somehow becomes more mature there, and then it breaks out into a wider market and keeps growing. So for the time being, tidal energy hasn't been able to break out of the niche to the extent like solar, wind, and biomass, and even geothermal. It was unable, so it is likely will be preserved. So there were some signs, even I think in the 1990s, for example, experiments in the UK, maybe in France, but so far it still remains in small niches, and given the overall landscape of available energy technologies, I wouldn't expect it to get a big market share in the decades to come. So at least this is my view.
May I follow up on this topic?
Of course.
Yeah, I think one challenge here is the reason, because I think when you look at, for instance, wind power, it's the energy production is going like u to the power 3, and the same will apply to tidal current. So, and the tidal current is not that strong. So it's a question about efficiency. So it might be good for some places, but not as a kind of major energy source because of the lack of efficiency compared to solar and wind.
Great, thank you. And now we have a question which I guess is directed to Astrid. So why doesn't Norway invest more in offshore wind power? It seems that there is a lot of potential for it.
I think the main reason is that we have so cheap power, because we have the hydropower. It's a clean energy source that has lasted for a long time, and it makes more sense to continue with cheap hydropower than to build more expensive offshore wind. I think if we were in a situation where you had a higher energy or electricity prices as we see in Europe, or if we had more fossil fuels in our electricity system, we would definitely move faster into offshore wind. However, there are many companies interested that are active in building offshore wind parks outside of Norway, and also it is coming yeah, more companies are getting interested in building in Norway as well. For instance, we could, for instance, export more power to Europe, where they don't have this clean energy, and they also have higher prices.
Thank you. And I also had another question. Oh, sorry, Vadim, you can go.
Wanted to add that this the thin profitability and feasibility of offshore wind, especially in case of Norway, strongly depends on interconnections. Because if there are good interconnections to Europe or to the UK, it can be really profitable. And for example, there is some, I think, North Link interconnector between Norway and the UK, which sort of has capacity like 1.5 gigawatts. Sort of this is comparable to a couple of modern nuclear units or a couple of modern coal power plants. And it costs, I don't know, 1.5 to 2 billion euro. So it's not as expensive as a power plant, but it is pretty expensive. So actually, yes, if a Norwegian company has an expertise for building offshore wind, probably it would be better use of its resources to build it next to consumers, for example, immediately in the UK waters.
Thank you. And I had a question around the offshore wind farms. So are the floating wind farms better for the environment than the non-floating ones?
Well, you don't have so much noise for installing them, I think. But I think, yeah, I'm not. I think the impact is so small compared to fossil fuels and the alternatives. So I haven't thought much about this, but maybe you can elaborate here, Kristin.
Yes, I think the answer is yes and no, because you have a lower kind of footprint when it comes to the seafloor. But the floating wind turbines will have a very large mooring system, which will take a lot of space at the seabed. And also there might be some more noise from the mooring in the operation phase. So it is a kind of mixed answer.
So we have another question here. It says how the funding system to establish the renewable energy from each country is the question.
Could you repeat? I think we missed the first part of your question. Could you please repeat?
I think that question has now been moved, so I'll move on to another question. But it says, okay, in the view of the panelists, how likely are we to achieve sufficient transformation to sustainable energy in time to avert a climate crisis? I guess that's quite a big question, but is there anyone that'd like to have a go at that? Yep, you're on mute.
Thank you. The most used phrase this year, you're on mute. I can give it a try. Will there be done enough in time? I think that depends on if you can invoke the market to react to demand certain energy types. We see in our business that there's the EU taxonomy, which is the new rules on evaluating which is a sustainable business and or not. So when this sort of trains gets moving, and if it really creates a big impact on the industry, tenants, like in my business, tenants will then ask, what kind of energy does my building get? Is it a carbon neutral building that I am in? And then we have to buy a carbon neutral energy, and we create a demand for that. And then when there is a demand, the supply will also increase. And then you have the chain reaction, so to say. So I think it's very important that it's a mix of demand and also supply and government policies to create the correct incentives. Sort of carrot and the stick. There needs to be more carrot demand to increase the right sort of energy. So I'm optimistic, but there needs to be more demand, the right kind of demand into the market, I think.
Yes, Kristin, if you want to unmute.
I'm rather optimistic because if you see the very fast increase in solar PV, for instance, when you look at forecasts 10 years ago, you didn't foresee this extremely rapid increase and the decrease in the prices as well. So I think if there is kind of political will and combined with, as Tor said, the market and responsible consumers that ask for this, I think we can make it, or at least get very close. So I'm a bit optimistic that we can make it, but of course it's very hard work. And again, I think it's very important to remember that we are not to replace all the fossil fuel. We are to give energy services, not to have all the energy that we used to use. We need just the services, and they can be delivered much more efficient with renewables.
Thank you for your answers for those questions. Another question we have here is, what do you all consider the best energy source today? So perhaps we could take a round for that one. Would anyone like to go first?
Okay, let me say, there is absolutely no best energy source today because there are very different conditions across the world, and obviously coal is not a starter. Obviously, fossil fuels are not good energy sources, and nuclear is very problematic. But for example, there are conditions where biomass can be the best source, there are conditions where solar can be the best source, or wind, or in some specific places, geothermal, and maybe in some places even tidal. So it's all should be tailored to local conditions. And and even in a marginal amount of gas still can stay as a balancing energy source, because otherwise you would have a huge surplus, a huge reserve renewable capacity just to be prepared for some short periods when neither solar nor wind doesn't work. Thank you.
Does anyone else have an answer for that question, or should we? Yeah, Kristin, if you'd like to go.
Yeah, I do agree. I think we have to consider the energy mix and the energy resources available at site. So I think it will be a mix of solar, wind, some places geothermal, and also heat pumps in order to utilize the electricity more efficient. So you will have a mix, and you have to utilize your resources locally. So there's no best, but solar, wind, hydropower will be on the top list.
Tor, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, just to elaborate on that, it's a mix, and you have to think locally. And maybe energy sources are closer and more obvious than you think. Like, for example, in Bergen, several places use seawater as energy. And we use it for cooling. University of Bergen also uses it for cooling. So we use it some for heating as well with heat pumps, but we are not allowed to use it for heat pumps too much, because then there is no market for the central heating system in Bergen. So, but there is maybe demand from local resources. Some buildings have access, some have that they can share locally. So a local mix and being creative and thinking new and created incentives that the market, that the actors can make money on local solutions. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else want to input on that one, or we can move on to the next question?
Can I add to this question?
Go for it.
I agree with everything, especially Kristin was mentioning the conditions for solar and wind. But I think the key is also what Tor mentioned, the market, energy sources that can be mass produced, standardized in small scale units have a very special advantage. So that is, and solar has the advantage of down scalability. You can run your wristwatch with solar energy very cheaply and efficiently. So you can make it as small as you want. You can build it into walls and roofs and cars and roads and whatever. So I think solar has special advantages, but I think the main factor here is mass production, standardization, and market forces. And to get this going, we need, of course, state power and public support to get things started.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now we'll move on to another question, and this is for Astrid. So what damage does the noise of installing offshore wind parks specifically do to the sea life?
I think the simple answer is that it scares them away.
Great, short and sweet answer. Another question we have here, a slightly longer one. It says, maybe a question for either Kristin or Astrid. Is it possible that you can comment a bit on the increasing protest against windmills in Norway, Denmark and Germany as well? People agree on the sustainable solutions, but they don't agree on how, where and what compromises should be done. I'm thinking of the wildlife and the marine life.
I can try to answer. I think the protest that we've seen in Norway is not mainly on the wildlife or sea life. I think it's mainly on people who don't want to see the wind turbines on the beautiful landscapes that we have here. And for that perspective, putting them offshore is a good solution. And for wildlife, I think also in some that it's better to place them offshore, as you don't have to, especially if the alternative is to make them on to build the wind turbines on a mountain far away, where you don't have roads already. You need to build so many roads, and this have a huge impact on the wildlife that you don't have offshore.
To follow up Astrid's answer, I think one reason why we have this very strong protests in Norway is also that it has taken very long time from conception to actual building the wind farm. So the turbines have grown a lot, and also the plans were not in line with what really comes. So some people feel that they are cheated because they were presented one wind farm and they got something completely different, much larger. But also one reason is that the people in Norway don't see why we need onshore wind, and by the way, offshore wind, because we have a surplus of hydropower in normal years. So I think that the kind of motivation is difficult to grasp for a lot of people. And also in general, the wind turbines have grown a lot in size. So they are very big now, even onshore. So that might be one reason why people are against them.
Could I just add also that I think it's important to keep the perspective here, because yeah, it's of course easier if you live in a country where you have a lot of fossil fuels to see that there are so many benefits with the offshore or wind at all, while in Norway the hydropower, as Kristin says, it's more difficult as you have a surplus, but it's also more difficult because the power we have is already clean. So why should we push another solution when we already have the hydropower?
Thank you. So now if we move on to another question. in regions rich in hydropower, such as Norway, there might be less need for geothermal to the mix of sources for electricity production. In those regions, my feeling is that its role in directly heating buildings is somewhat overlooked. In the example that Tor demonstrated, heat pump technology was implemented for cooling, yet the focus of the talk was on solar energy. Would any of you like to comment on the role of geothermal, or specifically shallow geothermal heat pumps? Would anybody like to take that question?
I can elaborate a little bit on it. We haven't tried geothermal in our buildings, but I know other places in Norway has done that. So it's which kind of energy mix you use is a result of an analysis in the early stage of designing the building. As with in Bergen, we are lucky to have the central heating system. The city burns heat to distribute throughout the city, and also we have our own seawater system. So that creates exciting mix. But if there is a building which is far from the sea and far from central heating, you will use different kinds of energies. And there is also a scale. You have to probably have a large building complex to use that kind of energy. So yes, maybe Kristin probably has some views too on this, but it's a analysis of project to project.
Yes, I do agree. I think there is a very interesting system at the HVL here in Bergen, which combines heating and cooling by storing the heat from summer and use it for wintertime and vice versa. So there are solutions. Again, you're talking about local solutions. So again, it's part of a mix, and it's part of what you need. But there are several public buildings in Norway having a kind of shallow geothermal system.
Great, thank you. We have another question here, and I think they're asking, so how the renewable energy has been implemented in the fishery sector in Bergen. If anyone has anything to comment on
that. I can comment on that. I know there is projects going on to make the aquaculture floating system, aquaculture systems have their own energy, because a lot of them have diesel generators on the floating systems. So there is projects on that. But if they have being able to make it totally renewable, I think there's maybe a mix there also to connect it to the grid and also have some maybe solar. But this is not, I'm not too familiar with that. I can just quick comment on the next question too. There is correct that the seawater can also be a part of the heat pump system that you use the warm and cool side. We only use the cool side because the city has regulations that we can't use the warm side to create the market for the central heating system. So this is a little special character of our system, but yeah.
Great, thank you. And I just wanted to quickly hand over to Vadim, because I know he was talking about earlier the impact of COVID on some of the energy transitions, if you wanted to talk about that. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Okay, let me just share my screen, and I will find. Okay, do you hear me? Yes. Oh, so these are some relatively new data from the International Energy Agency about the effect of COVID on energy systems, particularly on electricity, which is an interesting question and sort of it tells us something about how energy systems work. So here are some results on the global level. First, GDP dropped by 4.4%. But electricity demand dropped only 2%. And in April, when they just started, in last April, they expected a drop about 5%, but this didn't materialize because generally electricity demand was shrinking during lockdown, but then it was quickly rebounding. So it shouldn't be expected that COVID will lead to some sustained decline in electricity demand. But different energy sources were not equally sensitive to these demand shocks. So coal was going down more quickly than this demand. Sort of total demand declined 2%, but coal the entire 5%. Gas went down 2%, approximately in line with total demand decline. And renewable sources were still growing. So this what was at the global level. And in Europe, demand went down 4% and coal went down full 20%. So this would be another addition to the graph I was showing, coal falling down in the European Union. This would be another year of strong fall. And in China, demand was still growing, probably the only large country or even a region in itself where electricity demand was growing, and coal stayed approximately at the same level. So there is the conclusion from this is sort of first, energy sources are sensitive to demand shocks, sensitive in different ways. And in a sense, coal is already a vulnerable and outgoing energy source, provided the demand is shrinking. But if demand keeps rapidly growing, then everything will be growing, renewables, gas, and even coal, although at a slower pace than renewables. And their forecast for the year 2021 that coal will rebound at least 2 to 3% compared to the year 2020. So this is not the end of coal. And but an important thing they state is in many countries outside sort of OECD, in developing countries, the perception of coal is changing. Because until recently, in countries which were not particularly rich and were not particularly technologically advanced, coal was seen as a default source of energy because it was affordable. Sort of a coal power plant was not very expensive, and coal was also not very expensive. It was dispatchable in a sense that it wasn't sort of a variable intermittent energy source, and it was secure because it was not subject to such energy security risks as oil and gas. But maybe sort of this decline in demand and decline in costs for renewables and decline in air pollution and sort of growing anti-coal sentiment all over the world, which is particularly strong in Europe among financial institutions, but it's also taking hold in other financial institutions, global, like, for example, the World Bank. This will lead to a significant change in trends for coal. So this is an overview of what COVID brings in terms of electricity, of global electricity system. Okay, so thank you.
Great, thank you. That was really interesting. I think we've gone through all the questions now. So if any of the attendees have any more questions, please put them into the Q&A chat and we can go through them. I had a question for Vadim actually, and it was what are the reasons for Bulgaria not committing to phasing out? If you could explain.
The reason for Bulgaria not phasing out is first because they don't have much other energy sources. So they run some nuclear reactors, but other than that, coal is their only domestic source. and somehow they are holding on to the energy security. And of course, they, like other coal producing countries in Europe, they have some coal mining sector. And actually here I would like to relate to Thor, because what he was saying about coal sector and labor union in South Africa is very similar with what we have in Europe. Because in South Africa, it's not just sort of big business or corrupted officials. There are sort of real mining workers, which has some glorious history of fighting apartheid, which were related to the ANC. And again, sort of, for example, especially, it was especially well publicized in Poland, where in addition to these shipyard workers, coal miners were essential in bringing down the communist regime. And sort of they have, in many countries, these coal workers have even longer history of protesting. So in a sense, coal miners are paradigmatic, at least in the 20th century world, coal miners are paradigmatic working class, sort of organized, working together, doing hard labor. So this is sort of working class as Karl Marx described it. So now the face of coal becomes politically ambiguous. And so that's why phasing it out is difficult, and it requires sort of fighting these interests.
Great, thank you. I don't think we've had any more questions come in. So I think I might sort of go on to the last final question, which is very broad, but wanted to see what you all think. So Bergen plans to be a fossil-free city by 2030. And I wanted to ask, do you think that we can be a fossil-free world in the near future? We could all take a round and answer that question. If anyone would like to go first.
I think it's about what you define as a near future. I think it will take a long time to get completely fossil fuel free, but I think we can achieve a lot in the next 10, 20 years when it comes to phase out coal, oil and gas. But I agree with something said by Vadim, that we might have a tiny part of fossil fuel in order to have it as a backup. And we must make sure we are efficient in the transition. But I think we can reach very good goals in 10 to 20 years, because if we look at the very rapid deployment of solar PV, wind and other sources as well. But not a fossil-free world. I don't think that's realistic in 30 years.
Does anyone else have any final comments for the?
Okay, so I would say that still would be in the very near future, this would be very difficult. And this cannot be left to the market for one reason, because there is already a lot of installed coal assets. And for example, when we are saying the sort of solar now in terms of capital, solar is cheaper than coal, this means that when you're making a choice between building a new coal power plant and installing a new solar panel, you would choose a solar panel. But there are huge fleet of coal power plants already running, which you can supply with relatively inexpensive coal, and you don't need to make any capital investment. So basically, in the longer term, coal is already a vulnerable outgoing fuel. The problem is that sort of its natural trajectory of going out under market forces is not what we need for saving climate. Sort of, for example, it would be going away, say, for 30 years and we need 15 years, or it will go away 40 years and we need 20. So this is what makes it difficult, and this is where some serious political efforts in addition to market forces would be required.
I agree with what has been said, that I don't think we can go to zero in my lifetime, but I think we can really decrease if we are inspired by how the what's in English, KFK gases, the Montreal Protocol, how to get rid of these gases. That was a success story, and it needs to be combination of policies and incentives to make the market forces work. So we see there is a lot of reduction in the car sectors, but of course that is big incentives in Norway to make that happen. So to put a price on pollution, put a price so that it's cheaper to go sustainable, that moves markets. So if something hits your own wallet, that makes people vote with their feet, so to say. So there's a lot of things happening now, but to take it all the way in the whole world, there are different needs in different parts of the world. So less and less, but not totally, I think.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any last final comments before we wrap up the event? Well, if that's everything, then I just want to thank everyone who attended this event, and of course thank you to all the panelists who got involved. With the new restrictions, it was a bit complicated, but I'm glad that we were able to still go ahead with the event and have an online platform. And thank you all for your presentations. It was really, really interesting, and I hope everyone learned a lot and enjoyed the event. Just a final word is that we do have a competition, and so the first 20 people to email Bergen Studentene email address with the words energy transition will receive 150 krona Foodora voucher. So as a thank you for everyone attending the event. So if that's it from me, if there's no other questions people have, then yeah, I'd just like to say again, thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoyed the event.